We had discussed that in the rate of photosynthesis, some or other factor behaves as the limiting factor. Now, we are going to talk about the various factors which can affect the rate of photosynthesis. So, we have 7 different factors. What is their role in affecting the rate of photosynthesis that we are going to see in this lesson. Before we start with each of the factors individually, I want you to understand one term, that is compensation point. Other name for this compensation point is threshold value. Okay. Now, what is this compensation point or threshold value with in context of these factors? See, at this compensation point or the threshold value would be that value of a particular factor where there is no exchange of gases taking place. Alright, supposedly we have a leaf, green leaf, that is being illuminated, that is being provided by all these factors. At that concentration of a particular factor, whichever is under consideration, that concentration or that value at which the rate of photosynthesis would be such that there would be no exchange of gases that would be taking place. There would be no exchange of carbon dioxide that would be taken up, or no release of oxygen would take place. Basically, we are going to deal with rate of photosynthesis in terms of evolution of oxygen. So, when there is no gaseous exchange that is taking place, that would be known as compensation point. And do remember, the respiration process is going hand in hand. So, whatever requirement of carbon dioxide is to be met by the plant, that would be taken from the respiratory outcomes, those products that would be of course carbon dioxide. So, don't get into detail of that, just remember that there would be a point in the concentration of these factors which would be responsible for bringing about a stage where there would be no exchange of gases. Now, talking about the factors, first of all we take carbon dioxide. As you know, carbon dioxide is the raw material for the process of photosynthesis. It is this carbon dioxide which has to get reduced and form the glucose, and that entire process leads to evolution of oxygen. We have done in great lengths about this. So, this carbon dioxide, you must be knowing, it would be taken up from the atmosphere, and the concentration inside the atmosphere is this. Right. Now, we have this carbon dioxide which would be required in different quantities at different levels in different plants. And what that is, this carbon dioxide, if it is available, supposedly I increase this concentration to 0.05, then the plant would perform the photosynthesis exceptionally well. So, this is one concentration, but beyond 0.1, supposedly it has been increased to this value, then the rate of photosynthesis would decline, and somehow we would reach the compensation point. So, we have the concentration of carbon dioxide which affects the rate of photosynthesis, and I need not to tell you because the effect would be seen as a result of carbon dioxide being the main reactant which gets reduced. It is the main driving force which is responsible for carrying out the process of photosynthesis. Now, we have two types of plants. You know that C3 plants, the requirement for carbon dioxide, such as their anatomy and such as the process, though main process of biosynthetic phase remains similar, but these both plants have little bit anatomical difference which is responsible for making C4 plants more effective in performing photosynthesis. Their photosynthesis performance is more effective, and you can say that they can use the resources whatever are being provided to them stingily. So, the compensation point, or you can say the threshold value, or the value concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere which is most suitable for C3 plants is ranging between 25 to 100 parts per million in the atmosphere, while for C4 plant they can perform the photosynthesis in quite a well manner at such low concentration as well. Okay, so these are the two concentrations, these are the two optimum ranges which these plants require when they are provided with carbon dioxide, then they can perform the photosynthesis in a better way. Moving further, we have the next factor, that is light intensity. Now, you know, there are two types of plants. One are the shade loving plants and the other one are sunlight loving plants. So first thing, one thing you have to keep in mind, that the plants which grow in shade, that is skyophytes, this is the name of the plants which grow in shade, they require as much as 10% only of sunlight. This much light intensity would be enough for them to perform the photosynthesis and reach the light compensation point, okay? And while we talk about heliophytes, those plants which are prone to grow in abundant sunlight, they would be easily classified as C3 and C4. So C3 can take up as much as 50 to 70% of sunlight, and C4, you would be surprised to see, as much as 200%. They have adapted so well anatomically, not morphologically. These C4 plants, they have so well adapted, they are so well adapted anatomically to take up all the shortcomings which were met by these C3 plants in terms of increasing their rate of photosynthesis, so that they can perform the photosynthesis in a much more efficient way. So we have that while the skyophytes would need 10% of sunlight and reach the compensation point, the heliophytes, those which grow in sunlight, they would be broadly categorized in C3 and C4. C3 would need 50 to 70% of the light, coming sunlight insolation, in order to carry out the photosynthesis. It would increase if this value is increased gradually, and they would reach the light compensation point. Same would be in the case of C4, but over here, so much is the efficiency at the anatomical level that 200% of sunlight, if it is provided, that also can be utilized, and the plant will not undergo solarization. Now we have a term over here. What is solarization? Beyond an intensity of light which would be measured in candles, that beyond intensity, the plant will automatically stop the photosynthesis. Now, why that photosynthesis stops? Because when a higher intensity light is falling on the leaf undergoes photooxidation, and then automatically what we observe is that the rate of photosynthesis declines abruptly. Okay, so if there is much intensity increase, this is percentage of the sunlight, we have the intensity of light as well, that plays an important role. So if that intensity is increased beyond the point, the light compensation point had come, now that intensity is increased much beyond that compensation point, then solarization would take place, which is not much it is not of that much importance, because it is not observed that much in the nature, because plants are very well adapted and this intensity does not go beyond a defined level. Okay, moving further, we have the third one, that is quality of light. Now you know that in the electromagnetic spectrum that we study, it is the visible light that is responsible for carrying out the photosynthesis. In that visible light, we had discussed that there were few wavelengths which were capable enough of having a high rate of photosynthesis, and it belonged to the region of red and blue light. So we have the quality of light that affects the rate of photosynthesis. Again, another point. Then we have one more factor, that is duration of light. If the plant is illuminated non-stop with a source of light, it will continue performing photosynthesis infinitely. Okay, you are not going to see any decline in the rate of photosynthesis if the duration is increased. Supposedly you had illuminated a plant for 4 hours, the photosynthetic rate would be similar. If it is increased to 5 hours, then also the duration has increased, but the photosynthetic rate is not changing. You are going to see any change, if possible, after 6 days. As many as 6 days would be taken as the time consideration for understanding that dip that would come because of the duration of light. So duration of light has always a positive effect, and it helps in continuous photosynthesis. Moving further, we have temperature. Now, what is temperature? What is temperature's role? You need not to know what is temperature. What is the role of temperature in the rate of photosynthesis? First thing that you have to keep in mind is that the photochemical phase that was in the beginning that we had talked about, the light reaction basically, which involves enzymes, but which involves that photon excitation and excitation of the electrons and the rest of the processes, Hill's reaction, that is not affected much by temperature. What is affected by temperature is the biosynthetic phase. Now, you know, the biosynthetic phase had so many enzymes, it was so difficult for you to learn those name of enzymes. So that involvement of enzymes, and as you know, enzymes are very temperature specific. So the change in temperature would bring the change in the rate of photosynthesis. If the temperature is increased, then there is bound to be, there is a possibility that the plant's rate of photosynthesis might decline. It would go in the same manner as we had studied in the law of limiting factors, that initially if you increase the temperature from 0 and move it further and further, the rate of photosynthesis would increase, but beyond a level the rate of photosynthesis would decline. Okay, now for this also, in the case of temperature, pay attention, we have different temperature ranges of optimum photosynthetic rate for both C3 and C4 plants. While in the case of C3 plants, you have 10 to 25 degrees Celsius as the temperature optimum, where the plant shows the maximum rate of photosynthesis. The C4 plants, they go way beyond, and the temperature optimum could reach between 30 to 45 degrees Celsius. These are the temperature ranges of C3 and C4 plants. Now, a question might come in your mind that why it is that this case is lower and this is quite higher. Again, whenever there is any chance of a question that is being asked, that what is the main distinction that C4 plants are so effective in photosynthesis, do remember that it is the rubisco that has been hidden. And in the case of C3 plants, if the temperature goes beyond this rubisco ditches the plant and it goes with oxygen and it leads to photorespiration. We have discussed it. So you have to remember that this rubisco is going to become more oxygen prone, and that means its affinity for oxygen increases if the temperature increases, and that leads to photorespiration. That is why these plants have kept the temperature optimum between this range. While the C4 plants don't have such problem where the rubisco is going to ditch the plant and go with oxygen. So they have the temperature range maximum between 30 to 45 degrees Celsius. That is the best way to tell that temperature has the effect on photosynthesis. Okay, that is why these are more efficient. Then we have another factor, that is oxygen. Though oxygen is believed to have minimum effect on the rate of photosynthesis, we have a term over here that you have to remember, that is Warburg effect. Name is sounding quite amusing, that it must be very great effect that we are going to study, but simplest, that when the concentration of oxygen is quite high, the rate of photosynthesis would decline. This is Warburg effect, which says that if the oxygen concentration is very high, the rate of photosynthesis would decline. But do remember, this concentration high and effect on photosynthesis rate is at quite high concentrations, which will not be possible for Earth to have it in its atmosphere. So we do not consider it as a great factor which influences the photosynthesis. Again, the effect is similar, that rubisco comes and has the affinity more for oxygen, and its carboxylase activity is almost reduced when the oxygen concentration is quite high. The last one is water availability. Again, over here you know that water's intake is required because it is the water molecule which breaks down, but that does not have much effect because that quantity is bare minimum that is required. Why water is required? Because in case the tissue is devoid of water, the plant would show wilting. When the plant would show wilting, the leaves will be wilted and they will not be exposed to all those factors which had an effect which we discussed previously, especially CO2. Light intensity would be reduced, the intake of light intensity would be highly reduced, and that would lead to the rate of photosynthesis getting declined. So the role of water availability has a broader aspect that could be considered, which is having a physiological effect on the photosynthesis process. So these are all the factors which affect photosynthesis, and the various terms that we had discussed, you have to remember them by heart.